I hope all you people had a lovely little stretch break there. And yeah, we can wrap up this module on conceptions of the common good now. So far in this module, again, we've seen a general outline for how appeals to the common good work. We've seen that these appeals to the common good involve three things: a normative claim, a triggering condition, and a practical constraint. And we've seen how the corporate conception responds to those three things and how this conception has some problems. It's too broad, it's too narrow when it comes to considering what counts as a threat to the common good. And we also saw that the corporate conception, might be a little scary because once the triggering condition has been met, once the common good is really threatened, there are few boundaries holding things back. Basically, anything to do that allow society to continue may be done. That's pretty strict, pretty scary, I should say. This is why Alex proposes a different conception of the common good. He calls this the generic interests conception of the common good, the generic interest conception. And so we can see how this, again, responds to those three parts. And so let's start with, again, always begin with the normative claim and see how it does that. And so go to page 21. If you go to page 21 there, starting down in the bottom left corner, here we can see Alex say that the generic interest conception identifies the common good with a subset of interests that are sufficiently basic or fundamental to individuals that they are common to each of the members of the community. Agents may differ widely in their particular tastes, preferences, career choices, and personal ideals, their individual conception of the good, but they share interests in being able to develop their intellectual and affective capacities in order to pursue activities that they find meaningful and to engage in meaningful relationships with others. And so again, remember, the normative claim has us ask, what is the common good here? What are the individual interests at stake? And the generic interests conception says that the common good represents our shared basic interests. So you can see it's a common good because it's something that's about our shared basic interests that, again, we have in common. And if you look at what Alex is saying there, and if you keep reading, especially at what Alex says those common shared basic interests are, well, this actually looks pretty familiar because it's our see, everyone keeps coming back to this idea about our shared human, as he says, intellectual and affective capacities to make plans and lead structured lives. We keep seeing this idea, the idea of human life. What makes it special is the ability to make plans and lead a structured life. We've seen this in the deliberative utilitarianism of John Stuart Mill. We've seen this in the anti-utilitarianism of Bernard Williams. We've seen this in the deontology of Robert Nozick. And now here again, we're seeing this in the generic interest conception of the common good. So our shared interest, this to make plans and lead a structured life. Remember, that's what I told you, the common good. We were going to start seeing that what makes it common is what we share. And what do we share? A fundamental interest to make plans and lead structured lives. We all have that. This forms the backbone of the generic interest conception of the common good. Meanwhile, so that's the common good. So what are the individual interests? So the individual interests at stake are just our personal goals, plans, and projects. In other words, our individual interests are the specific plans and lives that we actually want to lead. So again, the common good is our shared capacity to make plans and lead that structured life, whereas our individual interests are what we actually want to do with that capacity, making up our individual goals, plans, and projects. For instance, look, I admit it, so I'm lucky. I want to be a philosophy professor, and here I am getting to do it. I'm very happy about that. So yeah, for instance, that's my plan, project, and goal is to continue to be a good philosophy professor. Now, you guys, I assume, probably want to do something else. Maybe not. Hey, welcome, join the club. But I assume most of you have very different plans, projects, and goals than I have. And yeah, those are just our individual goals, plans, and projects. And they're very different. We don't have, and maybe some of us have very little in common when it comes to that, because we just have different ways of conceiving what gives our life meaning and value. That's fine. So our individual goals, plans, and projects may be very different. However, we still have a common good between us, right? And that's what Alex is here getting at, that the common good, that yes, our plans, projects, and goals, yes, we all differ very greatly on these, but still we have a shared interest to be able to actually make those plans and to then actually act on them. So yes, we share a general interest to make plans, live a structured life. We all agree on that. And then we just, where we diverge is what we do with that capacity, because we have different plans, projects, and goals. And so what we're seeing here now, so now we can start putting some things together. Let's go back to the corporate conception. The corporate conception says that there are two types of entities. There's a social entity, and then there are the individual persons. And the common good here is the greater good of that social entity. And then, of course, when there's a threat to that common good, well, the interests of the individual persons may be sacrificed. Anyway, but now let's switch over to the generic interest conception. Now, the generic interest conception says there are two types of interests, our shared interests, and then there are our individual goals, ends, and projects. And here the common good now is the set of our shared interests. Now, if you jump to page 22, look at the bottom of the middle column, we can see how the triggering condition works for the generic interest conception. Here, Alex says, many more things pose a threat to the common good on this generic interest view than on the corporate conception. Common forms of injury and disease may affect only individual citizens, but they threaten interests that citizens share in being able to convert resources into what they view as meaningful activities and projects. The same is true for social exclusion, persecution, and biases in the law or their execution. Such social inequalities may adversely impact only some individuals, but they impact interests that all members of the community have an interest in safeguarding and securing. So when recall, if we're talking about the triggering condition, this again has us ask, what constitutes a clear and present danger to the common good? And the generic interest conception answers this by saying anything is a threat to the common good, is a clear and present danger, anything that threatens the ability of any of the community's members to make plans and lead structured lives. And as Alex notes, this is actually kind of a lowish bar for threats to the common good, because first and foremost, a threat doesn't have to affect literally everyone or even a majority of everyone in society. This threat to the common good might only impact a minority of people, and yet it still could be a threat to the common good. Because think about things like disease and poverty. Yes, disease and poverty may only affect a few individuals, and disease and poverty may not threaten society as a whole because they only affect, a limited number of people. But according to the generic interest conception, this can still be a threat to the common good because things like disease and poverty can prevent people from making plans and leading structured lives. It affects that fundamental capacity, that shared interest we all have. And similarly, if we think about the rights and liberties of a minority, those can be limited. Society won't crumble. Society could go on, but this is also limiting the rights and liberties of a minority is also a threat to the generic interests conception of the common good, since limiting the rights and liberties of that minority, that prevents that group of people, again, from making plans and leading structured lives. And so again, in all these things, poverty, disease, restricting rights and liberties, these don't have to destroy society. They might only affect a small group of society, but yet they're still threats to the threats to the generic interests conception of the common good, because these are impacting how those people can lead structured lives. And so that means the triggering condition has been met, and it's much easier to be met. And so then, of course, if the triggering condition has been met, then, well, what may be done? Alex doesn't have I'd quote him, but it's kind of spread out over a couple pages. If you look on pages 22 and 23, I think you can start to see what he's saying. So I'll just say it. The idea is that here now, the practical constraints are, what you can do is much stricter. Because namely, if the common good is threatened, that means that there are people who are unable to make plans and lead structured lives. That's a threat to the common good. Then the response to that crisis that response itself must ensure that it is not making it even more difficult for people to make plans and lead structured lives. Remember, that's the consistency we need from the practical constraint. If we're worried that people are unable to live structured lives and lead structured lives, then whatever we do shouldn't make that worse. It should only improve people's ability to make plans and lead structured lives. And so again, to make this more concrete, we can go back to the Paris attacks. Now, the corporate conception would say, if this is a threat to the common good, if the triggering condition has been met, then yeah, the interests of individual persons may be sacrificed. Probably Muslims and probably other people as well will have to have their liberties curtailed, in the name of national security. That's the corporate conception, right? If the triggering condition's met, people are going to be losing their liberties. It seems almost inevitable. That's the trade-off that the corporate conception says must happen. But let's look at the generic interests conception, which seems to be different. The generic interests conception would say, well, when we're looking at the Paris attacks, well, first and foremost, the common good has been threatened. It's not even a question. The triggering condition has absolutely been met by the Paris attacks because those terrorist attacks absolutely intended to inspire fear in people, making people too scared to make plans and lead structured lives. I mean, that's one of the purposes, I'm assuming, of terrorism, is to put that fear, make it harder or more difficult for people to live their structured lives, to execute their plans. So the generic interest conception says this triggering condition has absolutely been met. So how can France respond given that the triggering condition has been met? So sure, individual goals, ends, and projects need to be modified. Sure, national security may require that individuals change their goals, plans, and projects. But that does not mean that all rights and liberties should also be sacrificed. Liberty and rights are absolutely essential for people to make plans and lead structured lives. So we cannot protect the common good by also subverting the common good. That's the consistency that's demanded by the practical constraint. So that is, we cannot protect people's abilities to make plans and lead structured lives by also limiting people's abilities to make plans and lead structured lives. That's inconsistent. That's violating the practical constraint. And so again, that's a very big difference between, I'll throw it back up there, between the two views. Because again, when we're looking at the corporate conception, it says, yes, the interest of individual persons may be sacrificed. And so with Paris, individual liberties may be sacrificed in the name of national security. But now look back over at the generic interest view. That doesn't say all interests have to go. It only says certain interests will have to go, and those are the ones about individual goals, ends, and projects. Those may need to be modified. And so all this, when it comes to the generic interest conception, leads to Alex's final point. Because again, recall we saw in the last video that the corporate conception has a zero-sum mentality where the common or the greater good pulls in the opposite direction, away from a concern for individual interests. And so when it comes to the Paris attacks, we get that U.S. diplomat again saying there seems to be an unavoidable trade-off between security and individual liberty at stake here. Now, the generic interests conception rejects that zero-sum mentality. It wants to think in ways where we could have, both, as much as feasible. If you look on page 21, look at the upper right-hand column, again, page 21, upper right column, Alex says, in the generic interest conception, the distinction between the individual good and the common good makes it possible to frame conflicts over the common good in a way that tries to accommodate the legitimate basic interests of all parties. When the individual good of agents comes into conflict with the common good, the goal is to resolve the conflict in a way that is maximally responsive to the common good, that is, to the shared basic interests of each. The goal is to resolve conflicts at the level of the individual good by searching for integrative solutions, modifications, and individual goals and ends that enable each party to pursue and exercise their shared basic capacity. So that's the crucial idea here we can walk through, is that we don't need everyone to sacrifice all of their interests, right? The corporate conception says you're going to have to make some sacrifices to your liberties, perhaps. Not true, says the generic interests. No, the generic interest says we want to protect everyone's basic shared interests. but we will have to ask people to modify their particular goals and ends. And so that's why we're looking for these integrative solutions here. We don't, we have area where we can look for these integrative solutions where we can try to have both, where we try to promote that common good, that is the shared basic interest, while simultaneously trying to allow people to have plans and meaningfully pursue them. They'll just have to change those plans a little bit, modify them in the name of the common good, but they will still have fundamental rights and liberties to do that. Some changes will have to be made. That's all. And so that's, again, we're trying to find solutions that satisfy both. So in responding to the Paris attacks, we may have to ask people, again, to modify their personal projects and goals for national security. But this doesn't mean that people will have to give up all their rights and liberties. Those we want to keep. It's just modifying the plans, projects, and goals that people have within those. And that's what then this approach recommends, that France look for integrative solutions that ensure rights are protected while also promoting national security. And this can have wider impact, actually, not just with France. Think back to Omelas, right? Omelas, you remember, this has been a while. We have that poor child locked up. And yeah, locking up that child may promote the greater good for Omelas, but that doesn't, we might start to say that doesn't promote the common good. It definitely doesn't promote the generic interests conception of the common good, because that child does not have her fundamental basic rights being protected, or that child doesn't have her basic fundamental interests being protected. So yeah, it seems that the personal goals, plans, and projects of everyone in Omelas should be adjusted by releasing that child. Yes, the great overwhelming prosperity of Omelas may be lost. And yeah, people are going to have to change their goals, plans, and projects. But in that situation, the common good may still be upheld. That is now everyone in Omelas, everyone including that child, can now have their basic interest in planning and leading a structured life. Everyone gets that interest now, and everyone gets that protected, again, including that child. Yeah, Omelas is a boring country like every other country, but at least it has the common good. The greater good may be sacrificed, but the common good, the good for each individual's interest, is now being upheld. But of course, we could go back now to that final example of torture, torturing the innocent children to save the, says now it's not about prosperity, it's about saving the lives of a million other people. And here we might find ourselves in a conundrum. Maybe Alex's generic interest conception doesn't give us as much help here as we would like, because when it's torture the children, or allow, a million people to die, it seems the common good is going to be, the generic interest conception of the common good seems to be ruined no matter what, because look, millions die in one case. And so obviously that destroys their fundamental interest in just having a life, right? That's gone. Or you can torture the children, and that obviously harms their interest in leading a structured life. But either way, maybe we're back to Walser again. We can't escape Walser completely, because we're still back with a true moral dilemma where no matter what we choose, we've let down the common good because someone's basic interests have been sacrificed. So just to review, that's pretty depressing. We've seen this general outline for how appeals to the common good work, involving these three things: the normative claim, the triggering condition, and the practical constraint. And now we've finally seen how the generic interest conception responds to those three things. Again, the normative claim asks us, what's the common good? What are the individual interests at stake here? And the generic interests conception says the common good is it's the set of our shared basic interests, whereas those individual interests are the individual goals, ends, and projects that each of us has. Now, the triggering condition has us ask what constitutes a clear and present danger to that common good. And we saw with the generic interest conception, it says, well, anything that threatens the ability of any of the community's members to make plans, lead structured lives. Finally, the practical constraint says, what are the boundaries for responding to threats to the common good? And again, the generic interest conception answers that by saying, you can do anything that does not further threaten the ability of any of its community members to make plans and lead structured lives. So that's the generic interest conception. Again, really emphasizing that core idea we've seen about making plans, leading structured lives. I've said it many times now, but that's the fundamental idea. Threats to the common good, threaten that, and our responses to those threats must themselves honor that ability and not further make it worse. So that's the generic interest conception. It does seem to be an improvement, I hope, over the corporate conception, though, as I mentioned, we might get cases like that one of torture where we're still not quite sure what needs to be done, because I'm not sure what an integrative solution looks like when we're in a dilemma like that. Whew, I'll leave it at that. I think that's been more than enough. Thank you for sticking with me, all you brave people. You guys are lovely that you do this. But let's remove some arm flab, pat ourselves on the back. You're almost done with another module. That's very good. So take that module quiz, maybe do some light tweeting. I have some thoughts about this. I'd be curious to hear. And then, of course, when you're ready to continue this crazy journey, we're going into deontology now. Well, you know where to find me. But in the meantime, hey, take care. Stay safe.